In the heart of Tokyo, old Mrs. Tanaka lived a life cloaked in silence. Once bustling with the laughter of children and the comforting presence of a spouse, her apartment now stood as an echo chamber of her memories. At 83, Mrs. Tanaka's days stretched long like shadows at dusk, each one indistinguishable from the next. The few neighbors she once knew had either moved away or succumbed to time themselves. Visits from her own children became rarer with each passing year, as they too became absorbed in the drudgery of modern life. Her solitude crept in slowly, like ivy growing up the sides of her life. With no one to share meals with, and no one to check in on her well-being, the walls of her home became both her sanctuary and her prison. It wasn't that Mrs. Tanaka preferred isolation. Instead, it seemed that society had slowly shifted away from her, leaving her in the stillness of her own existence. This was life in the shadow of Kodokushi. One summer evening, she sat watching the sky darken from her small window, the noise of the city a distant hum. Reaching for her old photo album, she traced the faces of long-gone friends with trembling fingers. The memories brought a bittersweet smile to her lips as her eyelids grew heavy. At that moment, Mrs. Tanaka felt an acute pang of realization. She could disappear from this world, and no one might notice. The fear was paralyzing but strangely numbing, as though she had accepted her fate long before it arrived. The days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and Mrs. Tanaka's figure became a ghostly presence in the building. The mail piled up, the utilities were left unpaid, and still, the world outside moved on indifferently. It wasn't until the pungent smell began to seep through the walls that her fate was discovered. The building's janitor, doing his routine round, finally noticed. The authorities arrived, and Mrs. Tanaka's lonely existence came to a solitary, undignified end. Her story shook the community, raising calls of concern and fear for others who might be living in such dire isolation. Programs were instituted, and community leaders began to visit the elderly in their homes. Volunteers came forward, wanting to make sure that no one else would spend their final days in such heart-wrenching solitude. Mrs. Tanaka had become more than just a statistic. She was a stark reminder of the silent epidemic of Kodokushi, a phenomenon that demanded collective action and empathy. And so, in her passing, Mrs. Tanaka unknowingly bridged the chasm between isolation and community, sparking a movement to reclaim the lost threads of connection in an ever-alienated world.